My name is Angelina Avedano, and this is Interspace, where we explore the spaces between us. Join me for discussions on a series of realities with thinkers, writers, thought leaders, and artists. Dr. Jaffa Frank is a teacher, writer, and archetypal mythologist who finds that when facing life's hardships, illness, loss, alienation, or death, the stories we embrace are instrumental in our restoration. Her own transformation of personal grief, stemming from endometriosis, trauma, and death, was mediated by the ancient Gorgon and other underworld myths. By engaging the experiencing body, mythic imagination, and narrating mind in healing collaboration, a meaningful restoring arises that doesn't deny the truth of suffering and yet opens us to compassion, resilience, empowerment, and joy. Welcome, Dr. Jaffa Frank. Hi, Jaffa. I am so glad that you agreed to be with me today and have this conversation. It's such a pivotal moment in our American history and what's going on in the nation, what's going on the planet. I think your work and my work, in a sense, overlaps in ways around grief. And so I'm hoping that we can have a very fruitful conversation about grief and transformation. So welcome. Thank you again for being with me today.
Well, thank you for having me.
And so I want to start by just talking a little bit about the connection between us and how we met. In that both of us we're going through the PhD program at Pacifica Graduate Institute. And that is where this overlap with mythology and grief was, let's say, where it really took shape for both of us, I think, at least our connection. We were always talking about trauma and grief and mythology just in our conversations while we were taking our classes together. And then there was just this pivotal moment. I don't know if you remember this moment, but for me, it was a pivotal moment, which was the day I found out my son took a one-way flight to Honolulu. And in the book, I talk about my son's journey and my journey with him, having schizophrenia, and he lived often on the street. And that was a moment where I realized that I'd really lost all control of his whereabouts and was not going to even be able to get, to reach him or to get to him if anything went wrong. I remember pulling over in a strip mall parking lot, completely in a meltdown, and calling you just in utter despair. And not only that, but being furious with the system that allowed this to happen. Just really out of my mind with grief. Do you remember this moment?
I do remember. Yeah, I was also parked in a parking lot of a Pier 1 Imports, actually. But I do remember. I remember the call very clearly. Yeah.
And it was just a straight. We weren't necessarily the closest of friends, but I do remember that in that moment of shock and despair, you were the number that I knew to call, and I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about that because I think it was you being with me. I mean, you didn't have any answers for me. There were no answers. Mm-hmm. But it was your presence that allowed me to just process that really terrible moment. And I just wonder if you might share, that connection that happens after you've experienced your own grief and how it is that you can hold space for someone in a state like mine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that part of what happens when we experience our own losses and we really acknowledge them and feel the feelings that are actually present and stay with it in a way that doesn't, that really accepts what's happening. And acceptance not so much being any kind of an agreement, like I don't agree with it, I don't like it, whatever, that all of that sort of becomes sort of irrelevant. And it just is this deep acceptance of what is in the moment. This is what I'm experiencing. And that sort of suspends judgment about what I'm experiencing, whether it's good or bad, whether it should or shouldn't be, and allows sort of open-heartedness and kindness and a receptivity. And so since I had been through that myself, and I think maybe it was even amplified for us because my experience was also really centrally located in motherhood, and so there was that added level of empathy. But there was just this sense in that moment when I heard your voice and I heard your not even as much of what you said as what you were feeling, that I could just very much be with that in empathy, because it didn't frighten me. I didn't feel like I had to defend myself against it, and I felt like I could just be with you in it because I recognized it. Right? There was that acknowledgement and that deep acceptance of this is what you were experiencing in this moment, and no judgment about it. And I think because there wasn't judgment about it, there's also no need to go into sort of the fixing mode. That's also a recognition out of my own experiences that no one can fix what we're going through. It's not about that. It's really just about being in it and being in community with someone who can empathize, someone who can just simply see what we're going through and be with it without forcing us in any way to go any particular place, no expectation about it. And then also, I think the other piece was out of my own experience was this trust that you were okay in this fundamental way, that even when someone's falling apart, even when I'm falling apart, that in this deep sense that maybe is sort of transpersonal, or you can use the word spiritual, or you can use whatever language you want that has meaning, that in some deep way you were all right, and everything was all right. And it's very much a paradox because everything was falling apart and it's not all right, and yet I could be in that trust that if I'm just with you and just present and hearing and listening and reflecting, that we're both okay. And it creates a space where there's enough room for however immense the emotion is, however immense the suffering or loss is, that there's enough room for it. So I guess that really did come out of my experiences. I mean, I have training as well, in counseling and psychotherapy and grief and loss and trauma and things like that. But honestly, the deepest capacity really comes out of the experience of it, and being able to meet you in that moment, and actually even feeling like the sacredness of your willingness to reach out, your vulnerability in that, and my vulnerability being able to meet yours.
Yeah, I do remember that in calling you, I wasn't calling you as the therapist or the person I knew that knew about trauma. It wasn't it. It was because of knowing your story. Mm-hmm. And you did mention that both of our stories, our grief is sort of centralized in motherhood. But and even though you said you could relate and feel the same thing, our stories are very, very different. It's a completely different set of circumstances and grief. In your book, Eyes of the Gorgon, I have it here with me. Let's see here. I can show the cover. Your book, Eyes of the Gorgon, Endometriosis, Mythic Embodiment, and Freedom. You recount your story of endometriosis, living with that and all of the grief that it brought you, which is how you were able to hold that space with me in that moment. Mm-hmm. And it seems to be that is, I think, doing this PhD work in mythological studies for both of us took us to the deepest, darkest places to reveal something even more about ourselves than perhaps we were expecting to find in that program. Would you say that?
Yes. I mean, I think part of what happened in that program, and I know it happened for me, and I think in my reading your work and listening and having conversations with you over the last few years, I feel like it's resonant in yours too. It's this sense of having had this grief experience and then encountering this mythic way of relating to the experience and sort of narrating experience and seeing stories that seem to all of a sudden explain the experience. So there's this aha moment also. Because the endometriosis was sort of this long, well, it's a lifetime relationship with a chronic illness, right? But then there was also this pivotal moment for me, which is the moment that we also could share really as mothers, or could connect around, and that is that my grief and loss in terms of being a mother had to do with the loss of my first two children. I was carrying twins, and my uterine artery ruptured in the 7th month due to endometriosis. And there was the artery was compromised because of scar tissue. Nobody knew that was even possible, really, and because of a hemorrhage. And because of the strangeness of the situation, even with medical care and even being in the hospital and them trying frantically to figure out what was going on, in the end, I lost both of the boys. And so, and also had what I understand as near-death experience. So there was this extreme loss specifically around being a mother, and all that meant, and as well as the sort of chronic many years of the relationship between my female body and motherhood and creativity and procreativity and endometriosis. So there was sort of two layers, but we were really, because of that particular piece of the story, and all of the things and all of the experiences I had within that were, many of which were confusing, disorienting, overwhelming, existential. When I encountered the stories, the mythologies, that all of a sudden felt like they could express those things and give them form and movement and community and context, it was really incredibly powerful. And I remember hearing some of those same kind of experiences for you with different stories around your own experience as a mother. So that approach, which was something that I had dabbled in a less organized way, in a less rigorous way, that program really was a place where we kind of got to be in that, and we got to be in that together, and we got to be in that apart and with other people in the cohort, and it was a very fertile way to interact with our own losses.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. In the book, you make a bridge. You bridge healing and restoring, a term we both use in our books. And since we're both invested in this process, I'd just like to talk a little bit more about how you began that restoring process. How did you begin to rewrite your grief story? And I know you've already alluded to myth and the stories, which allowed us to both do that. But could you maybe even talk about a story or tell how that started to really take shape for you?
Mm-hmm. It was interesting because when this all happened, I was 29 years old. I really didn't have any of this psychological language or mythic language or archetypal language or any of that. So, but what I did have was this experience that was that shattered all norms for me, right? And one of the things that seemed to happen sort of spontaneously in the face of that shattering of assumptions, of sort of ego understanding of reality, of values, all that, was that it kind of opened me, and I was more receptive to other ways of thinking, except that's the wrong word. It's not really cognition. It opened up things, like, for example, like my dreams. My dream life just really expanded, and that wasn't something I sought. It's something that happened. Some of these particularly the near-death experiences, that I had encounters that I couldn't put language on, and encounters of this experience of being really held in this sort of, again, I'm going to use the word transpersonal, because it wasn't human, kind of loving, holding kind of thing, experience that I wasn't particularly religious. I didn't really have a context for it. And so I have these experiences. So then what happens is this sort of imagery, mythic imagery, just starts to emerge on its own, sort of spontaneously. And I got curious about that because these potent dreams, these potent imaginings about what the experience felt like. Some of the imagery was even Christian imagery. This sense of really feeling crucified, and yet simultaneously really feeling like Mother Mary at the foot of the cross. And having the loss of the beloved son or sons in my case, right? So that the sort of spontaneous arising of that kind of imagery is really potent. And then I also I think part of it too was that I truly asked the question, why me? And I asked that without it being about I truly wanted to know the answer. Like, why did this happen, right? And not in any sort of blaming kind of way, or any kind of that there was going to be some rational explanation, because there were medical, explanations and things like that came later, but that wasn't really what the question was about. The question was really about something that wasn't concrete, something that was what I'd call archetypal or existential, like really why. And I think that question, because I really embraced it and really wanted to ask parts of myself that didn't have the answers, it opened the door to, it made me even more receptive. And I encountered the myth of the descent of Inanna. And Inanna and her sister Ereshkigal, who's the goddess of the underworld. Inanna is the goddess of the upper world, and it's an ancient Sumerian story. And that story just gripped me, because I felt like I was reading a narration of my experience, even though the story is not, the plot line is not my plot line. Mm-hmm. And the elements of that story became so powerfully important, and it still is. I'm still working with that, and it's still working with me and on me. So that was another moment of encountering this sort of mythic context that threw me a lifeline and started helping me answer the question, why me, for myself, because I think each of us does that for ourselves. It's not, somebody else can't answer it. In the same way that when you called me, you weren't asking me to answer any questions. You weren't asking me to give you any guidance or fix anything. You were the one who has to do that for yourself. I'm the one who has to do that for myself, for it to really be truly deeply meaningful. But I'd say that story yeah, it was a hugely important one. It still is.
Yeah, I was just working with that last night again as I'm preparing for a workshop, and every time I come back to the story of Inanna and her descent into the underworld as everything, step by step is being taken away from her. And there's a really beautiful narration of the story that I'll share with you. But where she keeps asking the question, what is this? What is this? What's happening? I just remember, and also feeling that completely, being disintegrated, being dissolved, just the entire obliteration of everything that you know to be true, everything that you recognize about yourself, your identity, your identity as a mother, all of these things. Grief just has a way of, the grief and despair just has a way of wiping them all away, and then you're left with this potential for the restoring, right? And I think that's what's so, I don't know if I would want to call it refreshing, but at least promising about the mythic approach, living mythically, or applying these stories. And some people, I guess some people might say, well, that's just a way for you to cope. And I'm thinking, well, maybe it is, but if that's what's happening, then there's no harm in that.
Right. Right.
How do we make sense of the senselessness of things we can't control, of losing twins, of having a son who's in the depths of schizophrenia? Why me? Why him? And those questions are unanswerable. And yet, even the gods, this is, I think, what always makes me feel a little bit better, is that even the gods can't get out of it, right? Even Inanna, Queen of Heaven, couldn't get out of it.
Right.
And
right, and I think you see that story repeated across so many traditions, and for example, that's the Christ story, and I don't mean any disrespect for Christianity and calling it a mythological philosophy, because for me that's the these mythologies are the highest truths, right? It is that story of how we cope, how we live a human life in the face of what could be interpreted as complete randomness. And I personally could not live, or chose not to live with that randomness, right? I felt like I had to make a choice between life and embracing life, even as it is, which includes death and disease and all these really hard things, or embracing fear, which is this contraction and this non-life, and so then it becomes a set of 100 different decisions, right? It's about what that means to live that life, to live that human life, to say yes over and over and over again, and then and to be able to find company in that process, which I think is what you're talking about too with the stories. Even the gods have to go through these things, right? To find company, and I think when people say, "Oh, it's just a coping mechanism," there's a sense of minimizing the value of the process. But in fact, meaning making is. I think it was Carl Jung says something like, meaning makes a great deal possible, maybe everything. So we do suffer, and we don't have to go looking for it. We don't have to create suffering; it'll find us. Life is hard, but it's also incredibly beautiful. But we as humans, and maybe other than human beings can do this too. I don't know, but we as humans certainly have this potential to unconceal meaning, and that makes things bearable. And not only does it make things bearable, but it leads us into something that you and I have talked about at different times, which is this reality of sort of post-traumatic growth. And it's not just, I'm not simply coping because I was able to turn to these stories and do this work. I'm actually able to show up when you call me and be in kindness and true empathy and compassion and love. To me, and in relationship, and to me, there is no higher good in my human capacity. So if that's coping, all right, well, that's pretty awesome coping. I'd rather be that in the world than something else.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so much. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up this idea of post-traumatic growth. You refer to that, throughout the book. And it offers some hope. I mean, even in the back of your book, both of our books end with a message of hope. And it seems so unlikely to talk about being completely destroyed by grief and then emerging in this place of hope and restoration, which is what the restoring or the restoration is all about. I think for me, so much of this had to do with learning how to let go of control of everything. I don't know if we've talked about trauma a lot in the past and early trauma in early life, childhood, maybe even pre-verbal, young adulthood, and how I expect that trauma just makes us feel as if we could just keep everything in line, and if we could just keep all the pieces together, and if we could just keep ourselves under control and line up everything and keep it contained, then we won't have to suffer anymore. And then you have these grief events or a particular moment or an encounter with grief and loss, and you realize there is no control. There's no control, and it goes against everything that you've tried to build so hard from the moment that for early trauma till that moment of catalyst, that moment that changes you permanently, where you realize you're not going to keep anything together. That was all its own story.
And I think even beyond trauma, I think sort of the Western ego, the ego that we consider to be our identities, which is the way most people think about who they are. It's really actually what I would call the ego. It's highly invested in control, and not necessarily in a bad way. Even it's just about trying to minimize danger, maximize abundance and safety, and protection for our lives and if we have children, for our children, for the people we love. I mean, there's a lot of, it's not like a bad or good thing. It's just, it is what it is, right? So there's this desire for it, and the imagining is that it is gonna create, or it's gonna minimize suffering. But of course, I remember the moment when I had the embodied, like gut punch sense of, I actually don't have control over anything that matters. I have control over what I make for dinner tonight, and I have no control over who lives or dies. Wow. Okay. And just, it's, you can say that, and it's pretty obvious, but at the moment when you feel it, moment when the loss is such that you get that, and moving into that moment and forward through that of, I actually don't have control over any of the things that really matter. There's an opportunity at that moment to go into total despair and nihilism, and nothing matters, and I don't have to, if I have no control and nothing matters, then I don't have to be or do anything. And I mean, it's just sort of like give it all up, right? But that's just one option. There's also in that moment the option and the opportunity to say, okay, if I don't have control over the big things, the things that really matter, how can I relate to life if it's not about control and power and fear? Oh, what if I relate to life as an actual relationship, as an actual, like being responsive, showing up to what's actually happening, and being in curiosity and kindness and receptivity and non-reactivity. And that's a really different orientation than the typical ego orientation, right? But we can move into that through loss, because we have this moment of breaking down the old way of being. The ego doesn't have control, and all of a sudden it's hit with that reality, and so you have a choice.
Yeah, and the difficult part of that is it's not like here's 3 easy steps to let go of your desire to control. Here is the 3 easy steps to get to that place. It is an organic unfolding of awareness, and while we can sit with one another having gone through it, we can't even say this is the path through it, right? It's very mysterious. It's a mysterious process. Mm-hmm. I guess perhaps if we were the writers of the Anana story, maybe that is the path through it, and someone did do a good job of recounting the path. But for myself, if I try to articulate that for anyone else, there's just no words around. All I can do is recognize it when I see it happening.
And I think what the Anana story does is rather than telling us what it's going to be and what the stages are. For example, there's this idea that there are stages of grief, which actually Kubler-Ross talked about. She didn't talk about stages of grief. She talked about processes that people go through when they're dying. So even that's been a little bit distorted. But instead, it doesn't lay out stages. It lays out a context, and it observes experience and relates that as a story, like you were talking about when Anana is going and she's coming from the upper world to the lower world, and she's stripped away of all of the power and sense of identity that is represented by her crowns and her capes and her jewels and all those things that I would consider part of like the ego identity, right? All those things that I thought made me who I was, right? Got stripped away one by one as I'm saying, what's this? Which is my why me question. What's this? And it doesn't tell me what that experience, it doesn't tell me those are stages. It just relates what that experience is like, how disorienting it is, how deconstructive it is, and there are other places in the story like that where there's a point in the story where Ereshkigal, the sister, who's the goddess of death and therefore regeneration, because the two are always together, is suffering greatly, suffering birth pangs as her sister is suffering death pangs. And she has this moment where she receives rapport and empathy for the first time. And it doesn't say what that is exactly. It doesn't tell you how to be empathetic. It's not counselor training and active listening. It's this picture, it's this metaphor, it's this archetypal image and context of what it's like when we first have an experience where somebody really sees our suffering and doesn't try to talk us out of it, doesn't try to tell us it's right or wrong, doesn't judge it, doesn't identify with it, and so therefore collude and keep us in a place that's not going to be a place we can sustain if we want to live, but yet simply just holds and sees. And to me, that there's this beautiful sort of hint at what that's like. And so in that way, it does give us a sense of what the story, a form but it never tries to solve anything. It never tries to oversimplify. It never tries to literalize. And so you're right, because again, we each come to that in our own way, and not everybody who has tremendous loss experiences post-traumatic growth, and it's not because they're bad or deficient or whatever. It's just, it's mysterious and it's complicated. And even in the literature and the research around post-traumatic growth, that, you know, they recognize and understand that even when someone can have a terrible loss, like I can look at the loss of my sons, and it's the greatest loss of my life. And simultaneously now, 30 years out, and actively processing that, I recognize these incredible gifts that came from that experience. They weren't easily given. You know, there's a lot of work and a lot of grace and a lot of that we can unpack, but I hold both. So it's not this idea that, oh, post-traumatic growth is all about, oh, it's all just wonderful and I would have chosen it because it turned out well. No, it's nothing that simple. It demands so much nuance and open-heartedness and not knowing and mystery, and just being able to be with the person right where they are without getting ahead of them, without assuming I know what their journey is or what it's going to look like on the other end. But I can understand and recognize, like you said, I think recognize is key, what's happening. Like, oh yeah, I can feel that falling apart, for example, and I can recognize that and not be afraid, and I can trust because I have those stories.
Yeah. You know, I think there is the kind of a compulsion. I know that before I went through my experience, and there have been many experiences, and I know you've had many losses throughout the course of your life, but it does seem to be that there's like one catalyst that maybe helps us to contextualize all of it in a way that we didn't before. Mm-hmm. And so I would have to say that before working through this process myself, related to my son, seeing him for the first time in 6 years at the state hospital, and just being completely overwhelmed with emotion and grief in that process. Before that, I would be compelled to try to help, try to make things better, try to say something, and none of those words, they fall so short when you're in the process of your own grief and your despair. If a person has not been through that, it's almost painful to have someone say something to you because it rings so hollow, and I don't want to make a judgment because I've done it myself with the best of intentions, but unless you really can recognize it's just so painful to be in it and not have that recognition reflected back at you, to you, like we see in the story.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I have my own experiences and stories about those moments where people had offered what they hoped was comfort, and it really was very, very not comfort. I also worked as a hospice bereavement counselor, and so you know, was witness to other people sharing those moments when they were you know, angry or hurt or whatever, hurt again by people who really did have the best of intentions. And you know, the amazing thing is, and maybe one of the miracles of this whole thing is, you don't have to have the same experience, but it feels like I have to be willing to recognize this deep well, or to recognize the depth of the other person's experience, even if it's not mine, and I don't have the same experience. I can recognize through my own experience, or even just through a really open and compassionate stance, the reality of what this person is suffering, and to not be caught up in having to make it okay, or to circumvent it, or to help in that way. But I mean, we're not given a lot of information about how to do that, so we fall back on ways that we hope will help, and sometimes it's really not helpful. But usually it is coming from good intentions. But if we can just actually witness what a person is going through and just acknowledge it with our hearts, engaged, and then we don't even have to have had the exact same experience, because we can't really. And I mean, in Buddhism, one of the basic ideas is that all life includes suffering, right, or dissatisfaction, and so we don't even have to share the same experience, and yet we can resonate with each other in a deeply supportive way when we don't feel afraid. Because I think a lot of times fixing actually comes from fear, in a funny kind of way, like our helplessness.
What do you think the fear is? Oh, helplessness.
Yeah.
Fear of helplessness.
Like, right. Mm-hmm. And so wanting to rescue that person from their own suffering, and thinking that that's what's going to help them. And it's really hard to see someone suffering. It's hard to be in suffering, right? And yet, as counterintuitive as it might seem, if we can just be in that and have love and trust in the mix, and not identify with it. And what I mean by identifying is, if I go into a situation where, for example, if when you called me that day, if I had just gotten overwhelmed with your the sense of loss and the sense of disorientation and just despair, then we would have just been lost together, right? And that wouldn't actually be empathy. We'd both be just lost, and we would just in a strange sort of way, I'd be identifying with your suffering. I'd make it mine, and sometimes we think that's empathy, but it's not really, because then we're both just in it, and yet, so it's this experience of really, it's as if I were walking in your shoes. I'm not actually walking in your shoes, right? So there's this sort of, so what's the quality that I have to bring in so that I can be as if? And I think those qualities like trust and love and the qualities that are not fear and not power-based, that I can just be with it, right?
Yeah, you brought up something's coming to my mind. You brought up earlier that you worked as a hospice. What was your role?
Oh, bereavement counseling. Yeah.
Oh, bereavement counselor in hospice. So you're holding that space for people who are moving through death. And I also just have this similar kind of thought about midwives holding that kind of space through birth and labor and birth, which is, both of those are, there's a releasing and a kind of surrender to the control of the body and all the forces of nature, that when you have to surrender to that, and a person who holds that space, either a hospice worker or a midwife, doctor, nurse, whoever it happens to be, has to be able to allow that process to unfold without trying to race around the room and get all whipped up into a panic as well. And it just seems like that's a really good metaphor for what you're talking about. It kind of like either birthing this grief process or releasing into death. It's a transformative moment. Right.
And there is this element of trusting the process. right? And you know, you can even, if you want to get less metaphysical, you can even just look at the neurobiology of these things, right? And if you know, you can be the calm brain in the room kind of idea. So if I get into, I mean, a traumatic reaction is a reaction that's it's an overwhelm reaction. Whatever the stimulus is, whatever's happening outside of me is so much that it overwhelms my nervous system's capacity to deal with it. And so that's why trauma varies from person to person, because something that happens to me may not be experienced as a trauma to you. It might be experienced as a difficult loss or a terrible thing that happened, but it might not be, you might not experience it as trauma. So what happens with trauma is the nervous system gets overwhelmed and it goes into this fight, flight, freeze pattern, right? And so what people are, I think, more and more understanding, certainly the people who study this already understood it, but I think even in the public, it's sort of starting to filter out, and understanding that in those moments when our nervous system kicks in that way, we actually don't have access to our prefrontal cortex. We actually can't think. There is no choice. We are not making choices about how we react. We are not making choices about how our bodies react. And we just don't even have access to our what we call our thinking mind. We don't have our access to the part of our brain that it does chronological time, that goes offline, which is why it feels like an eternity, like timeless. Like when something like a car accident's happening, people were talking about, it was as if it was slow motion at the same time as it was really fast. Like there's, you know, people will describe those kind of things. So we know that when we get overwhelmed and our nervous system goes into fight, flight, or freeze, then we, and let's say we encounter someone who's in that state, our own nervous system can get hijacked into that, right? And we have all these things like mirror neurons and these other capacities that make it so we can get hijacked into that. And so then we're both dysregulated. And that's another way of understanding what I mentioned between when you and I had that conversation. Like I could have gotten into, my brain could get disorganized. My nervous system could get activated. I could go into fight, flight, or freeze. Freeze being sort of dissociating, fight being trying to fight you, argue you out of it. Flight being panicking with you, or saying I gotta go. Right? So there's all these ways that could happen, right? But none of those things would, at that moment, once I'm in that neurobiology, then we're just all in it, and it's very difficult, right? Then it has to like run its course and whatever, and there's panic. But if I can recognize what's happening, and I can be as if, like that's that empathy piece. I can also my brain can stay calm. I can trust, and I can stay receptive and calm. And I think this is a practice, like you mentioned before. This isn't one decision. This is a decision and a decision and a decision, a choice, and a practice through life of being able to not move into that, so that my nervous system, my capacities to self-regulate and not get reactive grow, and then I'm not going into that neurobiological state of trauma, of traumatic reaction. And so I think that becomes a really important, like just a really concrete way to understand what we're also talking about from a sort of metaphysical or archetypal or psychospiritual language of story and narration. There's also this beautiful mirroring in our biology, which I find incredibly, I don't know, just precious and useful.
Absolutely. It's validating.
Yeah.
It's validating because it's like, it's science, right? And it's right there unfolding within us, all around us. It's not just something we're grabbing a hold of that's something outside of ourselves.
And it even challenges this idea that there is an opposition there between the scientific and the mythic. I mean, I don't buy that division. I don't, in the book I talk about, my experience does not validate the split between mind and body. I don't even know what that means. And yet that split is fundamental to our current paradigm, right? And yet that, and it's something that we're, is breaking down in all of this breaking down that's happening, right?
Yeah.
And all this deconstruction of what's happening. But yeah, in fact, it's just, different ways of seeing it.
Because I wanna shift into that. So I'm glad you brought it up, because in your book you cite Peter Levine's work quite a bit, and but something that caught my attention as I was looking at through particularly the last chapter this week was something about healing the cultural wound that he said. And here we are, a deeply wounded nation, and while we do have finally a resolution, a decision here in November, on November 8th, about the presidency, we are in a heightened emotional state as a collective body, with a lot of wounding. Where would you say we are as a collective in the nation in the grief process, and how do we get to this post-traumatic growth that you're talking about? Or do you think that we will?
I mean, I think how where I am with all of that right now is just, Levine talks about, when he talks about the collective, this kind of collective wounding and healing, he's really coming at it from, he is coming at it from a sort of a neurobiological perspective. And for him, in his understanding, and I think there's really some merit in that, and it has a lot to do with unrecognized loss, traumatic loss, unacknowledged traumatic loss, and the way that we behave when that is what's going on. So when we have trauma, when we have extreme, overwhelming loss, and we feel threatened on that existential level, threatened on the level of my existence, right? That's all that means. Us or them, and it's not just us or them; it's them wants me gone, and right. So it's that level. When that's not even acknowledged, when it's not grieved, we tend to go into perpetration and escalation and violence, because it seems to be sort of the nature of one of the things that seems to be true about trauma is that it has this capacity for reenactment. There's something about the neurobiology that keeps reenacting. And we know this from PTSD, with soldiers. That's probably an area that most people have heard about this, right? Somebody goes into a reenactment, or you'll hear about that with victims of extreme violence, such as rape or things like that. So, but this can be collective too. And so we go into this sort of collective mode of reenactment and of perpetration and escalation and violence, and we don't even pause to recognize that that's what we're doing, and that underneath this aggressive behavior is some sense of our own vulnerability, our fear, right? Because power is really a reaction to fear. Power over. I'm not talking about empowerment, but power over is a reaction to fear. I wouldn't need to have power over you if I didn't want you to have power over me, if that weren't dangerous for me existentially, if that weren't bad for me. So there's this relationship there, but it's all based in this sort of this sort of fear. So Levine, sees how much unresolved loss there is in this culture, where we're supposed to just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, or we're supposed to, have our 2 weeks of bereavement leave, and then we're supposed to be back on the job, 100%. Or, if we grieve or mourn really actively, then we need to be medicated with psychoactive medications because we're depressed. Well, that's just grief. Or on the other extreme, we end up getting so overly identified with victimhood that becomes a whole industry, right? So we have this splitting around it. But he's looking for this. What's the core? What's underneath all this? And so he really sees this as all this unresolved trauma. And so for me, when I look at how things are at this moment, my sense is that what's really needed is the capacity to, first of all, stay self-regulated, to be a calm brain, and not get caught up in this intense reactivity, this fear, this fight, flight, and to be able to practice the capacity to see the humanity, or the soul, or the preciousness, or whatever, the belongingness in the other person, no matter what. So it's this capacity for what I would call non-contingent love, or relatedness, that's not based on whether I like you or don't like you, that's not based on whether I agree with you or don't agree with you, or can understand you or whatever. It's just based on the fact that you, because you exist, and you are alive, and you are on this planet, you belong, and you have merit, and you have validity, and then to be able to see that you have your own vulnerability, your own suffering, your own fear, and to start there, and to just be able to acknowledge that, and not just like as a thought process, right? To really challenge my own judgments and my own self-righteousness. So it's painful because we have to turn towards our own difficult aspects and grieve those, because I'm not the person I wished I were, right? I can be self-righteous. I can be judgmental. I can say those awful things about them. And then I'm just a part of that consciousness, right? And so then we have the opportunity to actually have some reconciliation processes. And I'm not a specialist in reconciliation processes, but there are a lot of people who are. And there are people who do reconciliation work all over the world, in South Africa, in Bosnia. And I mean, there are people who can do this work and can help us do this work. And we can learn to do this work with each other and reach out. And that can be kind of trite. And, you hear people reach across the aisle and all that. But honestly, we have to start, I think, or I have to start in my own circle and connect with what we have in common, how we are the same, instead of how we're different. And that doesn't mean that I turn any kind of blind eye to hurtful, harmful behaviors, or that it's not Pollyanna-ish. It's not, everything is, if I just love everyone, everything is great. It's way harder than that, right? This is real. I'm not being Pollyanna-ish about it. But if we can recognize that there's suffering there, we can recognize that there is shared humanity there. But I even hesitate to say humanity, because I think we have to reach towards the planet and other than human beings in the same way. Recognizing our absolute radical interconnection and this non-contingent love, which other spiritual traditions have names for this, right?
I'm thinking about something Thich Nhat Hanh wrote about interbeing, to interbe, which is the same concept that you're talking about. That's one that comes to mind.
Yeah.
But yeah, there are various ways to articulate just our connectedness and relatedness, as you're saying, that really isn't based on anything other than what is reality.
Yeah. and what we hope for our children, which is that we probably all of us want the planet intact. We probably all of us want our children to be healthy and happy and loved. So for me, I can feel that pull towards that being a way of a path forward is with children, right? Because children are they're still figuring it all out, and they're still open. I read about some research in reconciliation that was done, and I wish I could remember where. I can't recall, but and they started with mothers and infants, and they started with the two factions, and the first step was the mothers from this faction taught the mothers from that faction one of their folk songs. And then they all sang it. And then these mothers taught them a folk song, and they all sang it. And then the facilitators supported the music with simple rhythmic kinds of instruments, because it turns out that rhythmic instruments like drums actually regulate our neurobiology. And who knows if that goes back to the maternal heartbeat, whatever that is, that there's some neurobiological efficacy there. So that's going on. And then they let the babies, these hot little babies who are crawling, let them start interacting between, the mothers on either side. And of course, your two mothers watching their two babies interact, the boundaries just start to melt away, right? These prejudices, these even the true differences, because there are real differences, and that's part of what's rich. But the connection gets made around that, and they're interacting, and pretty soon the mothers are interacting, and everybody's in this context of this music, this rhythmic music, and it's just, and then there were some other parts to the process, but that's the kind of reconciliation work that can transform old enemies. Doesn't mean they're all of a sudden going to be part of the same culture, because they're not, and they don't need to be. But what we need to do is not kill each other because we aren't part of the same group, right? We need Republicans and Democrats to be able to govern our country together, right? I mean, on the most basic political level. So I think reconciliation is really the key, and I think it has to be community based, and I think it has to be based in true compassion for each other. And there are all kinds of communities that where reconciliation is needed. I mean, I don't feel like as a nation we've done any appropriate reconciliation work with the native peoples of this country. There are huge reconciliation issues with the African American population because of our history in slavery and our founding. That being one of our founding, I don't know, sins, whatever. So, yeah.
It seems as I'm listening to you talk that evidence of reconciliation might be considered joy. And the reason I say that is I think about your book and my book and the arc of the storytelling and the arc of the unfolding of myth, how myth starts to transform the story, and then we find ourselves transformed, through the language of myth ourselves. We can then tell a new story. So it seems that evidence of the reconciliation, because that's what the process of the books are, and both of our books, written at different times, we didn't talk about really what we were writing about when we were in the depths of writing them. We talked about lots of aspects of our lives, and while the day that I made that phone call to you was not at a time when we were particularly, we had talked through all of these things and we were particularly close. However, over time, I think our relationship has deepened around this shared experience and our ability to relate to one another and also to share the language of myth. And both of our books, we talk about just unbelievable pain and trauma and death and grief. Those are the similar themes, and yet we both are moving towards reconciliation and joy in the end. And I wanted to just ask you how you arrived at that joy in your own life, and then how do you cultivate hope that we can experience that kind of joy on a cultural level, as you're saying?
I think for my own process, joy is not something that I went after. It wasn't a goal. What it was is it's sort of the natural, spontaneous response to a long process of revelation, maybe, which is actually, and I don't mean that it's also there's so much creativity in the process, and it's easy to start thinking, gosh, I don't want to. It sounds like these women are talking about years of being in grief and talking about all this hard stuff. Oh, that sounds awful. But it's not. It's much more creative than that. It's much more, you go in and out, right? Mm-hmm. You touch things, and then you touch what's difficult, and then you touch what's beautiful and nourishing. And there's this
and maybe it creates that forward momentum.
Right. And I think that, honestly, it goes back to that, in part, it goes back to that really early experience. For me, after my sons died, I was faced with a choice and a decision about whether I would have children. And I was because I had endometriosis and have endometriosis, there were true issues in terms of my fertility, right? And so there was a certain level of maybe urgency if my husband and I wanted to have children, and so there was that. And there was that, and I was faced with, okay, well, are we going to try again? There's some danger with it. The doctors were especially nervous because of this hemorrhage and this rupture, and was the artery compromised permanently, and could there be a full-term pregnancy, and all that, right? And then there was my own sense of fear for myself. I had basically died and come back, and that was a potent experience. And it was like, wow, you can actually die, and as a 29-year-old, that's kind of big news. You kind of think you're never going to die when you're 29. And then the pain and loss of my not only my sons, but my identity, and my sense of relatedness with myself, with my husband, with the world, and my own philosophy of life and what I had thought were the rules of life. So all that had broken down. So there's all that, right? And probably more. And in the face of that, I'd mentioned before that I made a decision to choose life, to choose love, to choose trust, versus to contract in fear. And what I meant by that decision for me, and this is just one version of that decision, and it's definitely, I don't mean it at all to be the truth about that decision, but for me it was the decision of whether or not I would risk having children, whether or not I would risk getting pregnant again. And for me, not doing that felt like I was staying in contraction and fear. And saying, yes, this is what I'm going to do, this is what we're going to try, was an alignment with living my life fully in commitment of what gave me meaning and what was important to me, and my husband, but mainly me. I mean, I was really the one driving it because it's my body. I'm the one who's going to go through this experience. And so even though in that moment it was that context, it continued to be that continued to be the choice. And the choice is always, is this life affirming? Is this aligned with kindness and compassion and those values. And when it is, then joy just is comes out of that spontaneously, right? And especially when, for me at least, when there's this deep sense of acceptance of things as they are. So it's not that I get to say yes to life, yes, but yes, but these are the caveats. It's just yes, with all of the risk, with all of the with eyes and heart wide open, right? And so I think that's what allows, at least for me, that's what allows joy. And a big piece of that is also saying yes to myself, like coming back to myself as and wherever those wounds are within me, around my own self-compassion, my own self-love. And I don't mean that in a narcissistic way, but in this sense, this deep sense of belonging, because I'm here. And it's the same kind of love that I need to extend to others, I first have to extend it to myself. And I think that's a huge stumbling block for individuals and therefore culturally. And that kind of goes back to your question, a long way around, but it really starts with that healing of ourselves, so that we may be truly related to another. And so, you can't, that's a choice that anybody's going to make, right? But again, I think if we can, one of the ways that I do that is I teach in a program, in a college that teaches future therapists and art therapists, and particularly I teach in an area of the evolution of consciousness. And, one of the key classes is this altruism class, which is really about, first and foremost, healing ourselves. Healing, and the students having that experience that Erishkigal has when she has these two little flies buzzing around her that are truly empathizing, that truly see her suffering, and that don't try to fix it, but that just simply mirror it back and simply understand it. And so the students having this experience with themselves and within their community, their cohort community, with me, of vulnerability and safety, and then they develop that safety within themselves, that capacity for self-compassion, and then they can extend that to others. So that's this, one small piece. And I think anybody who's called to this needs to figure out their own way of offering that. And so, collectively, I don't have an answer for how that works collectively. All I have is what I can do in my own life. And I think projects like this conversation and others are other things that we can offer. And there are probably some other really great ideas out there and great ways to approach this that would have more meaning for other populations, right?
Yeah, Jaffa, I am so filled with gratitude in knowing that you're doing that work in the world. Also that you've been there and mirrored this experience with me and helped me process my own grief and work through a point of transformation, and that we can share this moment together. And so I just want to thank you for all the work you've done, for your book, this beautiful book, and which takes people shows people how you can transform an experience of chronic illness, and read that mythically and give birth to your own joy. And that it's just a beautiful thing to watch, and that doesn't take away from the unbelievable grief that you experienced. And I'm really sorry and sad for that you did experience that. And I know that we can both say that and mean it, and also celebrate the wisdom that we've come through through those grief events in our lives. And so I just want to thank you so much for having this conversation at a time when so many people are grieving, and that they can hopefully identify with the process and see that wherever you are in the process, there is an evolution taking place, and there's light and growth and beauty in the midst of tragedy. So thank you so much.
I think it's about letting ourselves be transformed, even more than us transforming anything. It's allowing ourselves to be transformed. And the first step is to turn towards ourselves with compassion, not self-pity, but compassion, and recognize that we're hurting, and that, and providing that empathy and love, so that we don't have to act out in violence, that we don't have to make the other, blame the other for our suffering. Mm-hmm. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and listen to you and learn from you, and and share these ideas in the hope that it's of any value to someone else. Then that's what makes it worth it. So Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jaffa. Jaffa's book, Eyes of the Gorgon, Endometriosis, Mythic Embodiment, and Freedom, is available on Amazon. To see more about her work, go to jaffavfrank.weebly.com. That's Jaffa, V as in Victor, Frank, phd.weebly.com. You have been listening to Interspace with Angelina Avadano. My heartfelt gratitude and appreciation goes to my husband, David Needs, Senior Production Engineer. If you would like to learn more about me or my work, look for me on Facebook and Instagram, Dr. A. Avadano, with Cicada Personal Metamorphosis. That's Cicada with a Y, C-Y-C-A-D-A. Or you can email me at dr.aavedano@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. This is Angelina reminding you that we're all connected.